Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. And all of us have been to the trade show floor. Maybe some of us in the room have been manning the booths at the trade show floors. And you all know the drill. You walk around, you're looking for some exciting ed tech. There's some, a bowl of candy. There's, an iPad to fill out a contact form on, and you get a small pitch. And some of those are impressive, and some of them are less so. The most impressive thing I ever saw at a trade show floor was like a literal waterfall, and then next to that, there were like massage chairs. You're thinking, I'm not going to the right fairs. I get that. And then sometimes it's really small. And so when you go to these, right, and I assume you're here because you are the kind of person who goes to these or runs the booth, that you're interested in finding something. You have a need in your organization, in your school, and you've got to fill it. And the question is, you walk into that floor and you're like, am I going to find it? And I don't know about you, I've been in plenty of those floors where I'm not sure that I found what I needed. And so the idea today is to maybe explore some of the ways that we can, some guidance for what to do as you're thinking about that situation for yourself. And what I'm interested in, though, is specifically some of your communication and feedback as we go. And I know you're on Zoom chat, so it's a little bit less, robust, maybe we'll say, than in other kinds of environments. But as we move through the ideas here, I'm very pleased to sort of interact and take a look at where you are at in chat, and especially if you have other examples or if you have some critical questions about some of the things I'm sharing with you in our short time together. So it's excellent to meet you all, at least virtually, and hopefully we can generate some useful information that can help you as you're working through some of those decisions. You'll note and my title has changed slightly from what it was before. I was promoted, which I guess is a good thing. But in my previous role as AVP, my job, one of them, was to work through and sort of manage all the selection process for the ed tech that was adopted by the university. And so this comes from many, many years of experience working with ed tech and trying to find the things that will help our faculty do what they want to do. And so I want to be able to share with you some of that wisdom to the extent that I can. Whoops, I went too fast. And so what I got for you here is two different categories of ways to think about, adoption of something new. And I've got these Greek theater masks. These in Greek theater, you'd wear a mask to sort of be able to communicate with the back of the theater sort of thing. And we've got the classic sad face mask on the one side and the happy face mask on the other. From my perspective, though, the happy face mask is relatively terrifying. I don't know exactly how comfortable I feel with that mask. And of course, if I was a podcast or a YouTube video, I'd ask you to chat about whether you thought that was terrifying or not. You certainly don't have to. I'll ask you more important questions as we go, but just in case you want to warm up the fingers, you can feel free to share any of your perspective on these Greek masks. And so these masks are going to tell me things that make me kind of sad or things that I have to think about critically when I think about ed tech. And then the happy mask, I promise it's actually happy, are going to be some of the things that I look for and that make me happy when I'm trying to find some ed tech that sort of integrates with the things that we're doing. So if folks are ready, let's move forward and we'll take a look at some of the ideas that we have. So some of the things that make me sad, and I've heard all of these from faculty, staff, administrators who are looking to select ed tech. And one of the things that I think that makes it hard for us to find ed tech that works is that we are excited by things. We go to that trade show floor, we see the waterfall, maybe we see something else, and we like it. And there's a sense in which there's a disconnect in terms of the communication between what the ed tech might do and what are the uses that it might have and what are the needs that it might have. And whereas in most sort of technological applications or acquisitions that you're working at in an organization or university, you often have a clear case for need. Like, well, we need to upgrade the Wi-Fi in this building. We need to upgrade our computers to be able to handle Windows 11. There are specific needs that can get met with a technological solution sometimes. But other times, and I think EdTech is the best example of that, and that's why it's hard, is that need is more amorphous. And in general, one of my jobs is I had a fund that I had to apply for EdTech, but there was not always a clear set of needs from the community as to what they wanted. And when you ask, sometimes they'll answer you, and I'll give you some of that for context as we move through these ideas. But at other times, people want something and they don't know what's available. They don't know what they want, but they want something more. And it's in this very ambiguous space where it's really hard to know if you're meeting people's needs because it's hard for them to articulate the nature of their needs sometimes. So, given that, a lot of these mistakes that you see up here are kind of inevitable, I think, in some ways. And so here's where you can sort of like warm up the fingers to throw some chat at us if you feel like, yeah, I've experienced that before, or, okay, maybe, or I have an example of how that worked. So we got what the kids are going to like, what the faculty will think is cool, which is the equivalent of what the kids are going to like. And then it has a cool app. And I've heard these three things a million times. Sometimes the kids are treated as students or adults. Sometimes the faculty are they of in terms of a specific name or a person or what they like. But in general, these are the kind of areas that we think about the wrong start to acquiring EdTech. So let's go through each of these with some ideas about the critical perspective that I'm giving you, and then some, examples of how it's worked. And in some cases, I'll give you examples of actual EdTech products. Other times I will, let the guilty remain nameless as we go forward because it'll apply a little more easily, given that some of it is a kind of very typical sort of thing that EdTech does. So first, what the kids like, what the students are interested in. And this is always a dangerous space for people who are not students to be thinking about. Here's what they like, especially if you're not in the classroom. What do the students like? What do they enjoy? And the classic sort of case is that, well, they're on their phones. They like their phones. They're going to like, an app, as you see on the bottom, without sort of understanding how they're using those phones, what their appeal to the phones are, and what they're supposed to do with them. So the classic, what the students like, and I even hear this on the trade show floors when I make it past the waterfall, they like apps. They like to be able to do things on iPad. They like gamification. They like badging, right? They like embedded social networking so that they can communicate with other users while they do stuff. Last time I went to a kind of ed tech sort of trade show floor, badging, gamification, and embedded social networking were almost the whole thing I heard from almost everybody. Everybody had that, right? And the assumption was for the manufacturers, for the software engineers, for the creators, and then for the people who are acquiring technology, is that that's what's needed. That's what people like. I don't know if any of you have had this kind of focus, for gamification and badging, especially as things that if we did this, it would work. If we did this, the students would use it, the students would like it, you know. And so for us, the biggest piece of what the students would like that's a little different than that is we acquired a kind of podcasting studio in a box, two of them. They were portable. The students could take and they could do a filmed podcast similar to, the most popular podcast that you can find, where the students these days, my students anyway, they watch their podcasts on YouTube. They don't listen to them anymore like all the old folks out there, like I do. I don't know if you listen to podcasts, but that's kind of where they come from. And so the thought is, well, students like watching that stuff. I think that they'll like be able to podcast on their own. And if we can get faculty to say, hey, maybe you could turn in a podcast with some friends instead of a speech, instead of a paper, instead of some other assessment, then you'll like that better. And mostly it sits around gathering dust because students don't really like podcasts that way. It stresses them out to make them. And for faculty, it's much harder to assess than traditional assessment. So we've invested in that because we thought that's cool. People like it. And it turns out that they don't like it that way. And they don't like it enough, again, because we didn't really find out, And so some of these are like, oh, well, why aren't you having a dialogue that allows this to happen? And you know what it's like. Sometimes things have to move too fast. You're approaching a fiscal year. People who are really invested in a certain decision want to make it in a certain way. And that's what we do. So second, what faculty think is cool is what we're going to talk about next. But I don't know if you have examples at your own institutions of things that you might have acquired or ideas that might have come forward really strongly as a wish list because it's just assumed that the students would like it. And maybe sometimes you're right. Maybe sometimes your process is more robust than ours was. But other times you're like, well, yeah, we thought that was going to be cool. Oh, and it just wasn't. All right, maybe not. Not seeing a lot of chat, so maybe not a lot of it happening. We'll see as we go in a second. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and make you look at my face and sort of see. Oh, so they're both terrified. So I missed the one chat that they're both a master terrifying. So it's really enjoyable to you that I have it up there in the corner at this time, I'm sure. Well, I made it smaller for you, sort of Hannah. So there you go. That's a little bit better. So We'll move forward a little bit. I know it kind of goes a little fast. There's not a ton of time, but and of course, for sure, you don't have to interact, especially if you don't feel it's valuable use of what you're doing right now. Some people prefer to listen and process in that way. Yeah, so we've got a comment that, is when we forget to ask the students. And I think it's really easy to do that. And I think it certainly happened in our institution. And again, maybe some other institutions for folks who are here have done a better job at asking the students, but I find often that asking the students, they also don't know what they like. And I will say, in our defense as an institution, we did pull together a small focus group of students with the podcasting stuff, and they all said it was amazing and great. And then none of them ever used it again. So, yeah, not to demean the idea that we should ask the students. Absolutely, we should ask the students, but sometimes the way we ask and what we ask is hard. And I think that goes back to the original question of we don't always know what the need is and how we might communicate with the students in that way. And so if we don't ask the students, as Hannah shared with us, the other issue is, of course, not asking the faculty. And here we have what faculty think is cool, which is also very similar. And so, I fear this will be a cavalcade of mistakes that our institution has made over the years. But that's, I think, maybe because we've been doing it a while. So we've had a lot of successes and a lot of mistakes. But one of our most significant, sort of underutilized pieces of technology now is a light board sort of system. I don't know if you've seen this, right? But you can write on the screen in front of you as you lecture, which is a super cool technology, right? And this was chosen by a faculty member who I think assumed because they were a faculty member, they understood how faculty members like to teach and what they wanted. And of course, it's largely unused for lots of reasons, right? There's a learning curve, there's other kinds of things. But some of it was that sense of how our faculty actually using and embedding technologies into their practice. And it turns out our faculty aren't interested in going to another building and recording themselves and figuring out how to practice writing on the board when most of them are using PowerPoints now. And so theoretically, it makes a lot of sense. It's a lot better than turning around and writing on the chalkboard, or the whiteboard. But in terms of what faculty actually will think are cool and what we think, doesn't quite work. And so the answer to both, I can anticipate the chat, would be, well, make sure that you're connecting with what students and faculty actually need. But again, my critical question is there, how do you know when you found it, right? How many conversations do you need to have and where do you need to explore? And maybe we need to be asking certain questions instead of others. And we'll try to get to those in the second half of what we're doing here. But the last is the cool app business. And I've heard this a million times as well. That, hey, this app looks really cool. It's really functional. It's really slick. It looks really interesting. And we often get this kind of like, ooh, that's really cool. The hard part is that everybody has a cool app. And so there are, of course, limits to that as you go. So, but really, literally, almost every piece of EdTech I see has an app, and they'll come at you with that light, the iPad, and they'll help you understand how it works. And you see this as well. So it's easy in some ways to have a dedicated app because it allows sort of programming to have sort of complete control over the environment. But it's also sort of unhelpful because it doesn't integrate with anything else. And I have sort of competing pieces of technology that exist at the school, and probably you do too, that were selected before, maybe even you got there, where they all have their own, whether it's web-based, whether it's app-based, they all have their own unique operating space that doesn't really communicate with anything else. And it becomes really difficult to sort of figure out what to do with the app. For example, for me, and I see a chat, I'll hop over to that in 1 second, is alert systems, student alerts kind of systems. All of those seem to have this kind of integrated space that is very separate from everything else and doesn't integrate very friendly with all the other pieces. Now, maybe there's a super expensive student alert system out there that we just haven't bought that does this, but most of the ones I see and I'm pitched on will have a kind of unique environment and ecology within their own space. And when asked about, integration, and I think this is true of a lot of spaces in the ed tech world, they say, well, you can import all your data into our environment, and then you can run all of these things from there. And it's like, well, that's great, but we already do all that other places. So there's this sort of lack. And I think when I see an app, I think for some people, oh, it's an app. That's really cool. We like that. And for me, I kind of go, oh, it's an app. That means it's not going to communicate. So let me take a look at what's going on in chat here for a second. Um, So I'm like, hey, light boards aren't great. And they're like, wait a minute, we love light boards. I get it. Every place is unique, right? And you have to have the conversations that you need in order to make sure you know what's going on. Well, Hannah, I appreciate you chatting for everybody. Everybody else is kind of just chilling and like listening and watching. And I get that. There's a whole vibe in here. But so I appreciate you sharing. I know it probably feels like you're screaming into the void. So I appreciate you. All right. So those are some of the sort of critical issues. And if we take sort of a summary of Hannah's comments and a summary of my perspective on this, I think we end up in a space where we need to have deeper conversations with folks, and we need to have sort of like deeper thoughts about how things integrate into the larger campus community and to the larger campus information infrastructure. And we may need to have more of those than we think. In my experience, and I know from the quick simple version of a summary of process I've given you, the feeling is like, well, I just don't think they did their homework over there. And that's part of what the issue was. And it may be true. But I would swear to you that we spent a ton of time on a lot of this stuff. And it felt like we were doing the right thing. And then it didn't work. And I think it's because maybe we still needed to have more conversations. We needed to think more critically about integration. But I think it's possible that integration is really hard because, as I said at the beginning, the needs are more opaque and it's more difficult for people to say what they think about it. As a quick aside, in my sort of previous life, I taught media studies and popular culture. And one of the things I'm always interested in is audience reaction. And one of the projects that those students do at the end of the semester is they talk to audiences, they do audience focus groups to sort of see how certain media affected them, what their reaction was. And one of the things that we talk about is if I ask you, how are you feeling when you watch this show? Might be your favorite show. There's a piece of you that's unable to answer that because the part of you that enjoys the show is not a part of you that's critically thinking about the show. Because the nature of entertainment is that I stop thinking and I relax and I check out for a little bit. So when I ask you about entertainment, you kind of have to make it up a little bit. And you have to sort of imagine, okay, I observe myself. If I have to observe myself, which the whole state I was in was a non-observational state, how would I imagine I was responding? How would I summarize the things I see in myself and my memory? And then how do I give it to you? And then you as the researcher have to decide, can I trust that? And so aside over, I think outside of the pop culture space, we're in a world in which what if these needs are unarticulable in clear ways, given the lack of knowledge people have about what's possible? So in addition to sort of conversation, it's a question of education, which takes us into the next sort of phase of what we're doing. I'm going to bring back those masks. Sorry. I know it feels like traumatic, like I'm just messing with you all now, but we're going to move on to some of the happy stuff, maybe. So maybe if we have the conversations in a better, deeper way, maybe if we're clearer on how the needs are going, and maybe if we help people through the more opaque parts of the processes to help them kind of understand a little bit about what's underneath the things that they say. In some ways, these are some of the things that I found are often underneath what people say. So we got LMS integration, daily practices, and nostalgia. And I want to take you through some of the ways in which this might help in our remaining what looks like about a little bit more than 10 minutes. So first seems obvious, seamless LMS integration. And so our campus uses Brightspace, which maybe your campus uses Canvas or something that's more widely adopted. But when I go to EdTech fairs, I can count on one hand the number of vendors who trumpet or when asked say yes, that they do integrate with Brightspace. It's just a smaller piece of the market, and there's not a lot of incentivization for folks to do the work, especially because it's a kind of twitchy piece of software in some ways. I don't know if there's any other Brightspace users out there. But for us, LMS integration is key, and I'm sure it is for folks who have a wealth of options when it comes to LMS integration, because all the apps try to integrate with Canvas, for example. But in general, though, as I'd said previously, in terms of the app sort of situation, most apps seem designed around creating their own information architecture and asking you to connect with that as opposed to the other way around. But things that integrate with an LMS, just they pop in terms of use for students, for faculty. We even have pieces of EdTech that the faculty don't adopt, but the students in a class adopt because it's so heavily integrated into the LMS that they have those options, especially for group work. The example I'm thinking of is Kialo, which is free, so that's something nice. And it's a kind of a critical thinking and debate platform that's sort of one of the few things like it that seamlessly integrates with our LMS. And because it integrates, the use is just higher, right? Because I can grade it, I can work with it in ways that sort of make a lot of sense. And we have more fully featured versions of what Kialo does, for example, but people don't use it because it doesn't integrate, right? So having that integration into the larger system, and it's obvious, of course, right? But the impact of that is huge in terms of usability. So we've tracked over many years the ways in which people use different pieces of technology, and looking at the differences between things that integrate and things that don't integrate is significant, including some really, really important processes we want people to be able to do, or that they want to be able to do, and then they won't do it in those other ways. The other example we have is Kahoot. Everybody knows Kahoot, quizzes, all that kind of stuff. Their integration into most LMSs is pretty reasonable. And to be able to do that is a kind of a big deal. So LMS integration. Okay, that's the obvious one. That's the low-hanging fruit. You're like, well, of course, Steve, we came here and you told us it should integrate to the LMS. We already knew that. So let's move on to stuff that's a little harder. And in principle, the idea of it integrates with people's daily teaching practice makes a ton of sense. But in a lot of ways, though, it's just like that question of the conversation at the beginning. How do you know what people's daily teaching practice is? And even when you ask them their daily teaching practice, does that mean it's the teaching practice they want? What would they do if they could do something else more easily? That's the dream of EdTech, isn't it? What are my unarticulated things that I want my class to be able to do with me that I didn't think was possible, so I didn't think to ask? So when I ask you, hey, what do you want? And you don't know how to answer it, and then I bring you some stuff and go, is this it? We have some trouble. So how do we get over that? Okay? And so I think a lot of it is from this perspective of daily teaching practice. And one of the things I would suggest for EdTech practitioners, especially if you're in a staff or administrative space and have the capacity, is to observe people from wildly different disciplines across campus. Get some permission, go in there, sit in the class and see what happens. Get some permission and join the asynchronous space and see what happens. What's the day-to-day look like? What's the minute-by-minute look like? How do they start class? How do they end class? If it's asynchronous, how do they begin the week? How do they end the week? What form do they interact with the students? And again, it's very similar to that pop culture example I gave you before. If I ask you how you teach, am I sure you're going to tell me how you teach? You've been doing it so long, and it's so important and intrinsic to your identity that there's elements of it that you have a hard time expressing, and you have a hard time expressing the importance of, because things come naturally to you. I just do that. I've been doing it for 30 years. That's what I do. Well, when I bring EdTech into the equation, it disrupts those patterns of habit. And if I don't know those things, which is the hardest thing for you to share with me, what do I do? So some of the ways to work on that is to create an observational space where you can really get into it with faculty and find out what they do and try to observe and sort of see. And, there's something about that. But it's hard to do. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of community buy-in to your role. And we find that really difficult. But when we've done that, it's really been successful. And unlike the podcast studio or the lightboards, Kahoot, for example, is widely adopted across campus because people were already doing quizzing sort of features before, and they were often using various app-based things that they bought on their own on their phones. It turns out that people spent a ton of money on creating quizzing services for themselves because we didn't have one as a university before we did that. When we did that, it enabled them to do what they were already doing easier because they could import it directly into the gradebook. People wanted various screen capture, screen recording devices. You're like, but Steve, you said they didn't like the Lightboard. They didn't. They didn't want to leave their office. All their books are there. All their PowerPoints are there. Everything is there. What they really wanted was to be able to record a lecture with their PowerPoint next to them in their office with their coffee. And even though it wasn't as cool as the Lightboard, it was cool enough and easy enough, and it fit what they wanted to do. And so when confronted with the better version, they said, no, we want the under-featured version because it's more comfortable for us. And if you think about asking people that, would you take the best option for your students, or would you take the option that's easiest, that's far less effective, but that makes you feel comfortable and you don't have to leave your house? It's hard for people to say yes to that, but that's kind of who they are, at least at our school. So here's some of the things they want when we've asked them these questions that we haven't really found. They want, attendance with integration to the LMS from your phone or AI, because Brightspace, if you don't know, diminishes your ability to grade for attendance because pedagogically the creators don't believe that's a reasonable use of the attendance space. But we have a lot of faculty who disagree and want that. And so how do we get that for them? They would like live in-person grading on a phone or an app. And I know I already told you they don't want apps and phones and iPads, but they want that so that they can click it and it immediately integrates with the LMS. People want push notification systems for students missing class or falling behind where you can set triggers and it automatically connects with them. And again, for all of you who can do this already, that's amazing. We can't do it with our system, and that's what people want. And so when I go to EdTech fairs, I'm looking for this stuff, and it's never there, right? Part of it is because this is a monumentally difficult task in some ways that has maybe not quite the rewards that you're hoping for. So when you find out what people want and how they do what they do, you find these kinds of things. And so that's kind of as we're heading out to the end of our time, we got about 5 minutes left. We're in that space where it's like, okay, I know I need to talk to them more. I need to engage with them more and figure out what they need. I need to observe them. But you end up in this world in which, what do we do when they ask questions you don't have any answers for? And how do we manage the sort of fallout from people going, well, you keep wanting to bring me stuff, but you never bring me what I want. And they don't make what I want. So why don't I just go back to what I always did? And you know, faculty, that's who we are. So there we get stuck. So last thing, though, before I get too downbeat, is this question of the culture of nostalgia. So somewhere between what I really, really need, what would make my life really easy, like grading right there on the phone, and things that I really love that make me excited about teaching is this question of nostalgia. Stuff that I love. Reason I got into teaching in the first place. My good memories about being a student. Because I know a lot of professors who just basically never wanted to leave school. So they didn't, and so they love school and they really have a lot invested in that. So sometimes the nostalgia is something like Kahoot. It's something we did before. People went to like library trivia or whatever and they played Kahoot there and they're like, oh, I could use it in my class. That's great. But the nostalgia I'm really talking about can be really deep and really tactile. And so the one thing I would sort of suggest, and it's a thing nobody would tell you that they need, so last time I went to a EdTech sort of space and was looking at the fair, everybody had these plushy balls that have microphones in them, or plushy animals or things. I've seen them before, maybe you've used them, but they're basically a microphone, right, in a ball, and you throw it at people. Okay. And so when you're doing discussion, you share it, right? And I have plenty of colleagues who for decades have used the sort of trick of having like a stuffed animal or like a talking stick or something. And then students would throw the stuffed animal at each other when it's their turn to talk as a way to like physically turn take their way through a discussion. We're at a small school, so we have the ability to do that in those classes. And these sort of plushy balls, these are ridiculous. Nobody's going to care about like, what's the use case of this? We have 10 people in class. You really need a microphone and a ball. And everyone loved them, right? I mean, not everyone, not the folks who are going to want to PowerPoint their way through class, but everybody who liked discussion things loved them. And I thought, you're not going to use these. What's the purpose of them? They have kind of zero purpose, because the kind of rooms that you would need amplification of for people to hear are too big to do a discussion session. And the rooms that are small enough to do a discussion session don't need amplification, but they're so fun. Faculty think they're fun. Students groan like, oh, when you give it to them. But then they kind of like them. And then the faculty like them, and it all works. And in some ways, I gave this to you last because it kind of sets up the sort of critical sort of issues between sort of like the really rationalistic kind of like, okay, let's ask questions, let's answer questions, let's do our research. But sometimes stuff like that, like how would you even know that that was a thing? How would you even know to ask somebody, do you want that? Nobody would ever ask for it. And it's one of the most heavily used things we have. So what do you do with all those pieces? So as we kind of pull it together, thinking about, good ideas and kind of broken ideas and how they work. I intended this session to sort of be able to introduce some like critical questions for you and let you leave sort of thinking through those elements, right? We need to find out what people need, of course. We need to have conversations with them, but we also need to do some deeper work to see what they actually do, what their practices really are, and what would make those things easier and more fun and more engaging for the faculty and the students. But along the way, right, there are some practical questions that we need in order to make things work. And there are things that we can do to facilitate getting to an answer, even when the answer is unknown. Because I guess, and we can talk about this here, my foundational sort of concern is that I'm not sure that the things that we do to have these conversations are deep and rigorous enough to get us the right answer. And the fact that surprising things like microphone plushy balls and stuff like that are what show up as things people would do when they won't go use the podcasting studio or whatnot indicate that there's got to be another way that we can think about how we engage more deeply and over time with people to be able to discover these things and to be able to allow them to be able to find ways to talk about these needs. It takes a while. And a better version of it is to find our answer towards that, which is unique to your own community. The relationship between faculty, the relationship between faculty and staff and technology, and your institutions all have a unique way that this works, depending on your size, depending on the ages of your faculty, their predominant kind of disciplines of people who are interested in ed tech, and there's a unique sort of structure there. But I want to leave you all with this sort of question about how do you find out the things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to know because people aren't sure how to express it. And again, there's no easy answers to it. And I know you hate going to sessions where the host like kind of leaves you with no easy answers, but I think it's something that each of us have to kind of think through on our own. So as we wrap it up, and I got 5 seconds, so I'm gonna do my best to take no more than one more minute. For me, when I came to these kind of revelations, which is I submitted this in the first place, I thought not only do I need to spend more time with people, but I need to explain this problem to my faculty and staff. I need to explain this dilemma between what the easy ways of us knowing what people need and the weird ways that people utilize stuff that's harder to talk about. And that disjuncture between those things, I have found over the last year and a half, when I kind of was like, okay, this is the thing. The more I foreground that question and that dilemma for faculty, especially, the easier it is to get them to the place where they can begin to talk about what they really want. Um, and I have too many faculty, I think, and maybe you do too, who've kind of long given up on this conversation. And so I would challenge everyone to think about that conversation in a different way. None of the stuff that I gave you here is like rocket surgery, right? You've had these questions before. It's just a way of which, how do we pull these questions together and think about ourselves as ed tech, adopters or practitioners? How do we think harder and better and have better processes about ways to move forward? And hopefully this gave you some of that. If not, uh, hopefully it irritates you enough to generate that answer on your own, which is really all we can ask for. So I'm going to wrap it up there and we'll see what happens next. So I want to thank you all for your attentiveness to that. Even though not a lot of chat happening, that's okay. It's how it goes. I'll forgive you if you'll forgive me for the theater masks. So thank you, everyone.